Okay, we've had the official door closure, so now we can get started. It was kind of stuck, it looked like, right? So this is week 5. It looks like we're back on the air. And we're talking about church history, kind of the history of the church, history of the theological development of Christianity, how it came to be the way it is today. And we've been dealing with early church period. We haven't quite made it up into the 300s yet. And we're going to go a little faster in another week or two. And so we've kind of... That's good. We've kind of broken it down. We're trying to do this in 12 weeks as a broad overview. And this is kind of a work in progress, and it's changing a little bit as we go. And basically, we've dealt with somewhat the philosophies of the day that helped form and shape early Christianity. We talked about the Apostolic Fathers, specifically Polycarp and Ignatius, Clement of Rome. We mentioned Papias. Those are considered basically the 4 or the 3 earliest apostolic fathers, post-apostle kind of people. And that's because we have their writings, or at least some of their writings. We also, with Papias, we don't have his writings, but we have him being mentioned by Eusebius, who was an early church historian. And I thought today we want to kind of talk about the Greek apologists that we really got to just at the very end of last week, when things were kind of breaking up and we were actually past time. And then a question came up, or not a question, but a comment came up last week about the New Testament, the New Testament text, the New Testament canon. So I thought we'd spend a little time talking about that today. And then we'll kind of jump in, hopefully, into these 3 types of Christianity that seem to have existed fairly early on in different locations. And then we're going to go into early church heresies, and then that's going to get us into a few later church heresies, and we're going to finally get up to about 451. And then after we get to there, we'll jump over a large period of time and more or less land in the Reformation, which is in the 15th century. So we're talking about these Greek apologists. These are early writers in the 2nd century. The most significant of those is this guy named Justin Martyr. And that's the case because he's really left the most writings that we have. And 2 of the most significant of those are this dialogue with Trypo, where he's dealing with Christianity versus Judaism and Old Testament. And then he writes probably one work that's been divided into 2 called the First and Second Apologies. And that's when he's dealing with paganism and trying to show how Christianity makes sense. And so he is dealing with this relationship of Christianity, Christian faith, and this is anachronistic to say classical culture or philosophy. It's classical from our perspective today, but for them it was their present culture and philosophy. It was the way they thought about things. It's the way they organized reality. And Platonism was a significant part of that. And Stoicism was also part of that. And all of these Greek apologists are also living in this world that is influenced by these ways of thinking. And so it's clear that Justin Martyr uses Platonic philosophy supplemented with some Stoic concepts in defense of Christianity. And one of the concepts that they seize upon, because it's a concept that's there, and also it seems to be brought out by Scripture and certain readings of Old Testament text, is that you can see Christ as the Logos, the Word. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. This was a conceptualization that was in existence within Stoic and Platonic philosophy. And so it was easy to seize upon this and see Christ as the Logos. The Logos of Platonic philosophy, the Logos of Stoic philosophy. Now, the other thing they dealt with is the relationship between the Christian faith and Judaism, because Christianity starts out basically, to a large extent, or at least perception for sure, as a sect of Judaism, a somewhat different kind of Judaism. Now, it departs from that, but that's the way it kind of starts out. And so when Justin interprets Old Testament Scripture, he finds types and sayings in the Old Testament that then refers to what are becoming clearly accepted New Testament text. And they use a typological methodology of interpretation, which is also something that the Apostle Paul does. You find types in the Old Testament that represent things. So, for instance, Christ is the Paschal Lamb, the Passover Lamb. Now, it's interesting that a lot of these early people were millennialists. In other words, they believed that Christ was going to return and there's going to be a 1,000-year reign. So all these guys, to start with, now you got to remember Christianity is being persecuted. It's not being persecuted in a super organized way. There's a lot of sporadic persecutions for varying reasons. A lot of these are just local. There are times when there are more systemic, wide-ranging persecutions directed by the emperor and themselves. But they're defending Christianity against the state religion, which is paganism, and these persecuting powers and authorities. And also they're having to defend Christianity from false teachings that are arising within the church. And they try to defend Christianity the only way you really can. You try to show how it's consistent with reality, which is the way people think. And if it's not, you have to kind of change the way they think. Now, the problem with that is when you start taking Hebrew, Jewish conceptualizations and bringing them to pagan society, polytheistic paganism, and you start trying to use their ways of thinking, it's pretty easy to start having things creep in that easily become false teachings and false doctrines. And most false teachings and doctrines are rooted in certain philosophical conceptualizations, certain things that you believe are true more or less as givens. It's just the way things are. And so to combat this, the earliest Christian writers and the earliest Christians, the Christian leaders, they use three things. They appeal to apostolic succession. In other words, the leaders in this church were appointed by earlier leaders in this church, were appointed by earlier leaders in this church, and they go all the way back to the apostles. And everyone did this. So you appeal to who came before you, and you're looking at this line of succession going back to the apostles. The other thing you appeal to is tradition. It's what we've always believed. It's what's been passed down. It's the rule of faith. And then the thing that they appeal to, and they start appealing to this at a relatively early time, is the canon, or what will become the canon of the New Testament Scripture. And of course, that's properly interpreted by those traditional beliefs that have been passed down. And so that gets us into this topic. Well, we talk about the canon of New Testament Scripture, or the New Testament. And just like the Old Testament, and we could talk about that as well, but we're not going to, we just don't have enough time. It doesn't arrive on golden tablets like the Book of Mormon, okay? It just doesn't. You don't go dig it up in the backyard and translate it. There's a process. And so it's very difficult to say at one point, oh, now we have it. Now, we recognize today 27 inspired books, that constitute what we call the New Testament. Those are the 4 Gospels and Acts. And it's very likely, there's pretty good evidence that at a relatively early date, probably even toward the end of the 1st century, there were circulating collections of those 4 Gospels in written form that were available to some people. Now you have to remember, we don't have the printing press, and it's a very labor-intensive process to produce manuscripts. And it's also a very expensive process. And so having a book is not like having a book today. It is a substantial undertaking to be able to have books, especially collections that are somewhat voluminous. So when you start getting a collection of the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, you've actually got a bunch of pages. But clearly that was in circulation relatively early on. And the other thing that was clearly in circulation relatively early on, almost certainly before the end of the 1st century, is Paul's epistles, Paul's letters. And oftentimes that included Hebrews. And less certain is a collection of what we call the Catholic epistles. They're called Catholic epistles because the word Catholic means universal. So these were letters written kind of not to a specific church like Paul writes his letters, but were really written to the church in general. You know, that's James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. That's what we consider to be the Catholic epistles. That also probably circulated at least at some point in the early mid-2nd century as a collection. And then likely these things begin to be collected together where you had the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the other writings, the Catholic epistles. And then you also had Revelation. And Revelation kind of gets to stand out a little bit by its own self. All these things were clearly written before 120, very, very likely, almost certainly before 100. And when you read the early writers in the 2nd century, they oftentimes speak of what's called, from a scholarly perspective, anti-legomena, which is books that were of somewhat questionable value. Clearly they had no problem with most of the things that were circulating. The Gospels, Acts, the letters of Paul. But some of the writings, some of the text were considered, at least at that point, to be of, well, we're not so sure about that. Hebrews was one. Now, everyone loved Hebrews. The problem that they had with Hebrews was that there was this dispute about who wrote it, because it doesn't say in the book of Hebrews who writes it. Now, it's attributed to Paul, and they oftentimes attributed it to Paul, but they knew that there was some issues with that. The book of James is also a little bit disputed. Not everyone seems to accept it. That's probably because some people see it as differing in doctrine from Paul and the epistles of Paul. And so they have this issue because of that. 2 Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation are accepted by most, clearly, but there's some people have some reservations about those. And then also you have to put a whole other group of texts that are treated, at least at this early point, somewhat similar to Hebrew, James, 2 Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. And that is a text called the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Acts of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Shepherd of Hermas that we've already talked about, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, and 1 Clement. Some people referred to these works in the same way that they referred to the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and some of these Hebrews, James. And so, while most of what we now consider to be New Testament texts, the 27 books, were clearly accepted, there was a little bit of dispute for a few of them. And how do they try to ultimately decide which ones get in and which ones don't get in? Well, it's not a real systematically organized process. It's kind of really one of these things that just kind of happens. But they make an appeal to apostolic succession. And when you deal with text in apostolic succession, what are you talking about? We need some kind of connection back to an apostle. And it really helps if an apostle actually wrote it. And we're going to consider that Paul was an apostle, and so there's no problem taking Paul's epistles. And we typically attribute Matthew to the apostle Matthew, and so the Gospel of Matthew's in. Mark was associated with Peter, and so that one, there's no problem with that. Luke, he's writing in association with, kind of running around with Paul. And so that's a connection there, and so Luke, Acts is no problem. But that becomes a problem with like the book of Hebrews. And then the other thing, and it's the most important thing, it's tradition. It is what is being used by the churches in various locations and places as New Testament Scripture. What books are they actually using? Is it being widely used? And then there is the concept of the rule of faith or tradition. So when a book, and that's when you get into these things like the Apocalypse of Peter, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Acts of Paul, when a book doesn't seem to be doctrinally correct relative to other things, then ultimately it kind of gets excluded. Now, what evidence do we have of a New Testament text? Well, the earliest written evidence would appear to be something that's called the Muratorian fragment or canon. It probably was written, this is a list. It's like a one-page list. It's a fragment that came out of something else and has happened to have gotten preserved. And it basically is 85 lines. It's a Latin translation, almost certainly from a Greek original, meaning that it's a list that existed prior to when it was actually translated. So we're saying that the translation is being done around 170 or 200, means the original list goes back before that. And it was found in a 7th, 8th century codex bound with that. That's how it happened to get preserved. And if you look at it, it almost certainly contained a list of Old Testament text that's lost, just from the way it's constructed. And it accepts 4 Gospels. It specifically names Luke and John. It doesn't name Matthew and Mark because they're lost. They got tore off. This is a kind of a fragment. You don't have the full page. You don't have everything. But almost certainly it's intending to include Matthew and Mark. They are there because it talks about 4 Gospels. It talks about Acts. It talks about Paul's 13 epistles. It doesn't mention Hebrews. It references John's epistles as different from John's gospel. It doesn't say 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's probably referring to all 3, but we don't know that for sure because it just says John's epistles. And it does have Revelation. It doesn't have James. It doesn't have 1st and 2nd Peter in the list. Oh, it does put the Apocalypse of Peter in the list, and it puts the Wisdom of Solomon in the list. Now, it specifically rejects a writing that we no longer have called Paul's letter to the Laodiceans and the Alexandrians. And basically it says that those are forgeries and that they were forgeries specifically constructed to promote the heresy of Marcion. And we'll talk about Marcion probably next week. It does mention the Shepherd of Hermas. It specifically says that the author of the Shepherd of Hermas was the brother of the Bishop of Rome named Pius, who was the Bishop of Rome around 140, 150, 155 AD. That's kind of one way we date this fragment because it refers to him as being a bishop most recently in our time. Now, in referring to this writing, it gives it secondary status. It doesn't put it into the same category as the other aforementioned works. And it does that because it was written more recently. In other words, it's not an early writing. Now, the construction of this list may very well have been due to reacting against Marcion, who's this heretic that we're going to talk about next week. Because what Marcion does in promoting his ways of thinking about Christianity is he produces a list of basically his New Testament text. He doesn't call them that, but he constructs a list of inspired, what he says are inspired works. And these include a modified version of Luke. It includes the letters of Paul with some modifications as his main canon. And so it may very well be that to react to that, other Christians start forming their own list. And that may be one reason we have this fragment in existence. Now, the next thing we have, and this is a pretty good ways down the road, is where all 27 of the present books is put into one list that we have a literary, historical copy of. It's in the festival, the 39th festival letter of Athanasius of Alexandria. Alexandria is in Egypt. Athanasius was the bishop of Alexandria. And each year, he writes a letter. It's called a festal letter. And it's to, first off, it's to tell you when to celebrate Easter. You know, Easter is one of those holidays, it's pretty easy for Thanksgiving, right? It's the fourth Thursday, right? Now, that's a different day, but it's the fourth Thursday of every November. Christmas is easy, it's the 25th. January the 1st, it's January the 1st, the 4th of July. You know, those are pretty easy things. Easter's all over the place. That's because Easter relates to what? It relates to the Passover. And the Jewish way of reckoning things was with a lunar calendar. And the moon has a roughly 8-day cycle. But you can't divide 28 into 365 and come up with an even number, okay? I mean, it's not an integer. And so there are like these extra days left over, and Jewish months were based on a lunar calendar. And then they had extra days, and they had some ways of taking care of those. But ultimately, Easter gets defined in relationship to the Vernal Equinox. That's the first day of what? Spring. That's March the 21st, March the 20th. That's when night and day are equal. Oh, by the way, they're equal everywhere over the entire world. And that's because of us being tilted on the axis and us going around the sun. Now, there are different ways to conceive of that. They didn't really conceive of it that way, but they could certainly tell when the vernal equinox was. And so you have to go to the first full moon after that, and then you have to go to the first Sunday after that, and it's a little bit of a calculation. And by the way, still Western Catholics and Eastern Catholics don't necessarily agree as to when Easter should be celebrated, okay? That's still part of a division between those. So it's all kinds of things that people have trouble agreeing with. But this letter specifically mentions all 27 of the books that we now have and consider to be New Testament. Now, looking at collections of these that we still have, but we actually have, basically there are three great unical codexes by I guess it's Uncle, whatever. These are written in Greek. They're Old Testament, translated in Greek. That's the Septuagint. They're various writings, but New Testament and others. We have the Vaticanus, which goes back to about 300 to 325, the Sinaiticus, which goes to 330 to 360. That's the date that has been given to it. And Alexandrians, which is 400 to 440 when it was felt that it was written. And there's also another one that's pretty incomplete, so I really wouldn't include that one, but it probably dates to 450. Now, that has 6 Old Testament books. It has the New Testament, but it doesn't have 2 Thessalonians or 2 John. The Vaticanus doesn't have 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, or Revelation. Now, it's clear that some of that's been lost, and so it may be that those would have been in the original document that was put together, but it's subsequently been lost. These things get rebound and various other things. Sinaiticus has all 27 books of the New Testament. Do I now?
Does it have others too?
Well, yeah, it's got the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. So it's and all these have basically the Apocryphal, which are those works that more or less cover the intertestamental period between Old Testament and New Testament. The Alexandrians, it has all 27 New Testament books, but it also has 1 and 2 Clement. Now, having that, does that mean that the person who put that work together thought that those also should be equivalent to the others? Well, probably. Now, there have been several what we now would retrospectively call Catholic councils, Catholic church councils, that kind of had some rulings on what they considered to be New Testament, what constituted the New Testament. The earliest of these was in northern Africa, in Carthage. It looks like probably around 393. They accepted the 27 books. Well, 26. They didn't include Revelation. But then in 419, they came back and included Revelation. And they had some trouble with the book of Hebrews because it was like, okay, well, who really wrote this? And they just kind of by fiat said Paul wrote it. There's no argument to establish that, but they just say, okay, Paul wrote it. And so therefore, it's okay. Now, Augustine was the bishop in this area at the time, and he's a very influential person. His writings are very influential, and we're going to get to some of those in a couple weeks. He still had reservations about who wrote Hebrews, but he liked it, okay? But that's that thing trying to say, well, look, to justify it, we need to have some kind of apostolic connection. And so we're just going to say it and be done with it. And we don't have to argue about it anymore because once you declare something like this, it's beyond argument. There was a reference to various books in something called the Canon of the Apostles that dates back probably into the early 300s. This is something that's referenced by various councils. So basically, for all practical purposes, by the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century, so that's like 400 AD, it's pretty much established that the 27 books that we have are now New Testament Scripture. And most of those were established, you could argue, from just the way they were used, even back into the end of the 1st century. Now, the Greek Orthodox Church still does not include the book of Revelation as part of the fully accepted canon. And there are other church groups, Coptics and various other sundry groups, that have lots of other books that they throw into their quote-unquote New Testament.
I think that's kind of important, right?
Well, it's a little bit, but you know, the main ones are pretty much easily accepted. It's just, it's the ones that are on the periphery, and one can argue that, you know, how much does that change anything? And then not much. Now, one way, and probably the best way, forget these lists. These lists are late. They're late putting down something that clearly already at least conceptually existed. But if you look at the writings of the early people, early guys, Ignatius, who died in 108, he's writing 7 letters on his way to martyrdom. And he clearly, in those letters, references Matthew, John, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy. There's like no doubt that he knows those writings. Probably has a copy of them. Now, whether he has a copy of them as he is being carried to martyrdom, I doubt it, but he knows those inside and out. And you can go through these 7 letters and you can find direct quotes and you can find allusions to easily 15 of 27 books and probably to another 6. And so he clearly, in these 7 relatively short letters, makes allusion or quotes maybe 21 of the 27 New Testament books. And just because he doesn't specifically refer to 2 Thessalonians, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, or Revelation, doesn't mean he's not familiar with those or doesn't use those. It's just that these letters, there's 7 of them and they're relatively short. So you have an incomplete set of writings from Ignatius, but clearly he's quite familiar with most of what we consider to be New Testament text. And this is what? This is at the beginning of the 2nd century. Polycarp, who's a little bit later, the only writing we have from him is this fairly short letter he writes to the Philippian church. And he writes that because they're wanting him to send a copy of the letters of Ignatius that he has to the church at Philippi. Now, in this little short letter, he deals with talking about Roman Empire imperial persecution. He talks about heretical movements that are threatening the church, specifically Gnostic movements, those that are at least put forth initially by Marcion and Valentinius. He mentions the Marcionites and the Valentinians in his letter. And in this relatively short letter, he makes 112 biblical passage references or allusions. 6 of them Old Testament, about 100 New Testament, and it would appear that he probably is drawing from at least 17 of the 27 books of the New Testament. And this is 150 AD. And if we go back even earlier, Clement of Rome, when he writes to the Corinthians, he writes a letter to the Corinthians because they done kicked out the leadership and installed new leadership there. And so he writes a relatively long letter to them, and he clearly references 10 to 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. It's no doubt that he directly quotes from Matthew and Luke and Romans and 1 Corinthians. He even specifically mentions the letter that Paul had written them, Titus, Hebrews, and he has very strong allusions, if not kind of quotes from Acts and Ephesians, 1 Timothy, James, and 2 Peter, and maybe 1 Peter and Revelation. Now, he probably also references Mark. It's always hard when you're looking at writings from these people because they don't mention the books by name. They just throw out a verse. There's so much, almost every word of Mark in the Greek is in Matthew, and most of it is in Luke. And so anytime you see a reference that we say is Matthew, it may well be to Mark, because if it is one of those passages that Matthew has in common with Mark, then you don't really know which one he's talking about, okay? So there's likely he's also referencing the Gospel of Mark in this letter. He doesn't reference John. And listen, you have to remember, he's writing this letter probably in 96 AD. And we think the book of John probably wasn't really written until 90 to 95 AD. So he probably doesn't have it because it's like not hardly been written yet. And he doesn't seem to reference 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John. And that would also make sense because those letters were probably also written in the 90s.
But was it Revelation written later as well?
Yes.
So it's confusing.
Well, that's correct. And then that gets back to part of the problem that you have in allusion. So that's a possible allusion to Revelation, okay? Because Revelation has so much stuff that's Old Testament, you can easily see what seems to be an allusion that's really an allusion to something else that Revelation has incorporated. So I would probably argue that he probably really doesn't allude to Revelation. I'm pulling this stuff from people who are writing about it, and their goal is to try to show how closely associated these guys were with New Testament text. And so they sometimes go a step too far. I mean, it's clear when there are direct quotes, and so you can put a little bit stronger faith in that. So Hebrews, Titus, I think Titus is quite significant that he's got Titus, that he's referencing Titus. In fact, a lot of these guys, pretty much all these guys, reference from a fairly early time 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They also tend to, almost all of them, reference Ephesians. Some of these are letters of Paul that more recent modern scholarship has tended to say really aren't Paul letters and were written at a later time. This is some evidence to suggest that, well, maybe that's really not true, which is what I think. So you have to be a little careful when you look at the allusions. So clearly, into 1st century, for all practical purposes, the New Testament text is in existence, but probably not bound together. You probably can't flop it down there and here it is, and there's 27 books in it, okay? How long is it till you actually have that? Hard to say. Like I say, it's very time intensive, very economically intensive to produce large numbers of books and things. And oh, by the way, these guys are still running around trying to not be martyred and killed, okay? So they don't have a lot of time for some of this. In fact, these great unical codices quite likely take form once Constantine more or less converts to Christianity. And he actually, according to Eusebius, authorized the production and backed and funded the production of 50 copies of the quote-unquote Bible. And very well, at least a couple of those, probably Vaticanus and Alexandrians, are maybe the result of that effort. So I think that was the bell. Was that the bell? Or not? Technically the bell?
Well, I might be cutting off early because
We're going to have an Easter egg hunt? Oh my goodness. Command, example, and necessary inference, and we're going to have an Easter egg hunt, right? Okay. Well, look, we'll go on just a little bit more and then we'll stop. So now then, what we're going to do, and we'll pick this up next week, is there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that the earliest church looked to Jerusalem and the church in Jerusalem as a center of authority and leadership. Not that every single little thing you did came from there, but they clearly looked toward it as important. That's why Paul, he goes and meets with those guys, and they have more or less what you can call a council. At least one and maybe two. But then what happens to Jerusalem? In 70 AD, Jerusalem is really, from a practical perspective of being a center of anything, is no more, because the Romans have sacked it, they've destroyed the temple, they've kicked out the Jews, the Christians had enough foresight to leave before that. And so Christianity then basically, by just natural processes, establishes other centers. They don't do it purposefully, it just happens. And Rome isn't one of those. Well, why isn't Rome one of those? Well, the Roman government, they're kind of like intermittently persecuting Christians. I mean, Rome is not going to be a real safe place to have much organized leadership at this time. And so the three places that you seem to see Christianity organizing around, and they are different geography, different underlying views and philosophies, which have some strong influences. Those are Carthage, which is in northern Africa, which is very Roman. In fact, it was destroyed and reestablished as a Roman colony in 146 BC. It's only 400 miles from Rome. It's a large place. So it clearly becomes a center of Christianity. Now, whether that Christianity came from Rome down to Carthage, or whether it came across northern Africa from the east to the west, we don't know. Given its philosophical underlyings, it seems to have more connection with Rome than it does to the further east, which would be Egypt and Alexandria. But Alexandria is another significant center of Christianity and significant influence on the development of Christianity. And the other place is Antioch in Syria. And with the addition of Ephesus, which is kind of probably more like Antioch, and Rome, you've got the 5 biggest places in the Roman Empire. These are the biggest cities in the Roman Empire at the time. And they become significant centers of influence for Christianity. And there's 3 people that we have significant writings from that can be representative of these areas and kind of their different approach, their different thought. And that's Tertullian, who is writing from Carthage, northern Africa, who clearly is familiar with Clement of Rome, Hermas, whoever wrote Second Clement. There is Origen, who is in Alexandria. These guys are about 170, 180, close to 200 AD when they're actually doing their writings. And there's Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus grew up in and around Syria, Antioch, Smyrna, and then he moves to France. And when he's writing from living over in France, where he's leader of the church there. And so what we will talk about then is the philosophical influences that these guys have and how that affects the way they interpret certain things. And Christianity, as we know it today, is basically somewhat of a mishmash of these different thoughts. And they get reorganized every once in a while. You know, we restore things every once in a while. We have reformations every once in a while. And you start bringing back in new concepts that get repeated over and over and over again. But some of the bases of things that we believe today come out of what these guys believed back then. Okay, so we're going to stop here. If you have any questions, feel free to text me or whatever. Just call me, email me. I will make changes based upon some of that. I got a slide on Epicureanism in here, okay? We just haven't got to it yet, okay? And we went off on the New Testament text this time because Jonathan had made a comment about it last week, okay? So it's, there's this is just wide open as which directions you can kind of go. I mean, so